Hello and welcome to this Play Better Chess video. And in this series, I go over games played by the greatest players of all time. So today, how to improve your chess with Paul Morphy. So you can never go over enough Morphy games. Paul Morphy was a great chess player, maybe one of the best in history. And this game takes place in 1857, which is when Morphy really kind of took off. He wanted to become a lawyer, and I guess there was an age restriction, so he had to wait, I think, till he turned 20. And so he took some time off after his studies to play some chess, and he entered the first American Chess Congress in 1857, played in New York. And basically he went up there and kind of destroyed everybody, won the tournament. Then he ended up going overseas to Europe and beating the greatest chess players over there. So today, Morphy has the white pieces, and he's playing Lewis Paulsen. They have ratings here, which these are probably estimated ratings because they didn't really have ratings. People may be considered chess masters back in the 1857 period. But let's get on with the game here and see what we can learn, how you can improve your chess with Paul Morphy. So first I will do a quick review here. I'll just pull that up. Now the computer is calculating the accuracy rating. So Paul Morphy played 91.8% accuracy in this game versus Lewis Paulsen, who played 86.5% accuracy. And 8 great moves by Morphy, 2 by his opponent. And then some inaccuracies, 5 by Morphy, but 12 by his opponent. 3 mistakes for Morphy and 2 for his opponent. So it should be an interesting game. We see Morphy had an edge and then kind of got behind. And then the game was even for a while before Morphy gained the advantage in the endgame. And one interesting thing about Lewis Paulsen and Morphy, there was a story about these two playing in a tournament or playing against each other. I don't recall if it was in a tournament or where, but it was before they had chess clocks, and Morphy was waiting for Paulsen to move, and hours went by. And the rumor is that something crazy like 8 hours went by, and finally Morphy said, excuse me, is it your turn, or are you going to move, or something to that effect? And Paulsen said, oh, I thought it was your move. And so after that, they figured out they needed chess clocks. All right, moving on here. I'll put the computer analysis on. Now, one of the ways to improve your chess is to go over master chess games like this and games of the best players. Try to find a player that you like their playing style, the openings they play, and then you can kind of try to emulate that player. Now, if you look at newer master games, their games are a lot more complicated, so you may want to try going over, especially if you're a beginner, start with, or even intermediate, start with games like this from back in the 1800s. They're a little more easy to understand. So here, Morphy begins with e4. And something that you may want to do is go over games yourself and try and guess what their next move is going to be without looking at the answer first. So Morphy plays e4. His opponent plays c5, the Sicilian Defense. So, we see the Sicilian Defense was played back in the 1800s, but maybe not as accurately as it's played today. This move counterattacks. It kind of unbalances the position a little bit. it covers this d4 square so that white can't immediately place both pawns in the center without it being captured. So Morphy plays knight to f3, developing a piece, controlling the center here, getting ready to push this pawn, because then he could capture with the knight instead of the queen. So, if he pushes here and this pawn captures and then the knight captures instead of the queen, then this knight can't move here and chase the queen by attacking this if the queen is in the center. All right, moving on. We have e6 here. So they're calling this the Sicilian Defense French variation. So that's interesting because in the French defense, a lot of times you'll have both pawns in the center, but it'll start out e4, e6 here. So the game continues with this d4 pawn push, and of course the pawn is captured and recaptured by the knight. And now we have bishop to c5. So apparently this variation is called the Paulsen Baseman defense. So, the opening is named after Paulsen along with some other player, Baseman here. So interesting. Probably these two chess masters played this variation. And now we have the best move played by Morphy. Now, what can you learn from Morphy's moves? Well, he is well known for trying to develop his pieces quickly. Even if he has to give up a pawn, give up a little bit of material to get all his pieces out quickly. And he tries to do that before his opponent is able to, develop all their pieces. So let's see what happens here. And that's important when you're playing your own chess games, is to try. And now the best move is played here. But what I was going to say, try to get your pieces off the back rank as fast as possible. And what I mean is the knights, usually first because they're a little slower. And that gives you time to see where to place your bishops. So then your bishops, then your queen, but you don't want to bring your queen out too far where it can be targeted. Usually the second or third rank. Sometimes you'll move out a little further, but you have to calculate and make sure there aren't any tactics that could put your queen in danger. And then you want to castle quickly to get your king safe and get your rooks connected and move those rooks into open files, half open files, or behind pawns that you plan to push forward. Okay, what did this move do? Well, it helps pile up pressure on the knight. It attacks this pawn, so there's a threat of just capturing the pawn. What does Morphy do here? Well, he jumps his knight forward here. Quite interesting. And the computer says this is a good move. But something interesting, it's saying that knight to a3 would be even better. But I don't know, with that move, I mean, we could take a quick look here. Knight to a3, the knight could be captured and the pawn's wrecked. Maybe. Well, then it just recommends that you check with the queen. So, if the knight goes here, you check with the queen, and then maybe you could pick off this knight and grab an extra pawn, something to that effect. You would probably still have to watch out, though, for this knight being able to jump here and then trying to fork the king and the rook. So already there's quite a bit going on right here in the opening. So let's continue here and see what happened. Morphy plays knight to b5. So, what does this move do? Well, in the future, he could try to play knight to d6, but at the moment it's covered by queen and bishop. But if this bishop is captured, then there might be the possibility of attacking the king here, going after this unprotected bishop. So let's see how the game continues. Knight to f6. Paulson just develops, but apparently it would have been better. The best move, and this is an inaccuracy, he develops the knight, gets ready to castle, and then targets this pawn. But capturing here looks like that would have been best. White would still have an edge here. After this, recapture, and then it's pretty crazy. The queen could capture here with a check, but that could be pretty dangerous. The bishop could block, or just the queen attacks here, and then you still have this threat of a check going after the bishop, although the king could move over, protect the bishop, or a fork, even more dangerous, a fork of the king and the rook here. So, what is going to happen next here? Let's see. If we go back to the game, knight to f6 was played. Morphy captures. Now, normally you don't want to move a piece twice in the opening, but here, this move captures a piece, forcing his opponent to capture or recapture, and then that gives Morphy time to decide what to do here. Now here, he jumps in, checking the king, and this is looking pretty dangerous because there's a threat of, well, the queen is covering that. So the computer says this is a mistake, that instead just developing the other knight to c3 would be better and guarding this pawn. But already the game is starting to get a little crazy here. So we have the knight jumping forward, checking the king, protecting the pawn. The king is in check and will be stuck in the center now, so that's probably why Morphy played that. But the king comes forward, allowing the rook to protect the bishop along with the queen, freeing the queen up from guard duty. So knight captures, rook captures, and now we have a battery threatening this pawn here. And this pawn is threatened as well. So the bishop move is played, a great move, taking care of both of these threats, protecting the pawn on e4 and this pawn here on c2. So knight to c6. Now Morphy, known for quick piece development, is falling behind in this game because we have two knights, a rook and queen, 4 pieces developed. The king up towards the center where it can assist in the endgame a little bit better, and Morphy just has 1 piece developed. And then there's a threat here of this knight jumping forward, attacking, maybe putting more pressure on. But Morphy castles, and then we have h5 here, pressing forward. Maybe a pawn storm is in the works here in the future. So Morphy develops his knight with the threat of maybe knight to b3, attacking the queen, and the pawn pushes forward. So what does Morphy do? He slows down the advance of this pawn, h3, but apparently that's an inaccuracy. That better would have been c3 to block the scope of the knight and the battery of the rook and the queen. But Morphy didn't want this pawn to just keep pushing forward and try and wreck the kingside pawns. Anyway, we have a pawn storm brewing. So this is one thing that you can try and do to improve your chess. If you have kings castled on opposite sides, or here the king is not on the king side, and so you can throw your pawns forward, aiming them at your opponent's king, and then normally you want to funnel pieces in behind those pawns. So if this pawn jumps forward in the future, the knight could back it up, but not at the moment because the queen and pawn are both covering g4. So A3 is played by Morphy to limit the scope of the knight. Maybe push this pawn and attack the queen in the future. And here we have a rook moving to, well, it was on a half open file, but now it's moving over, lining up on the king, and getting behind a pawn that can be pushed forward in the future. So a counterattack by Morphy attacking the queen. Queen retreats, but keeps an eye on this diagonal, aiming at the king. And now the knight continues forward, harassing the queen, and the queen retreats back further here. So the game continues with Morphy solidifying his pawn structure here, I guess, defending this important central e4 pawn, helping protect it from the knight, possibly capturing. Also discouraging the pawn thrust here, because now, one of the pawns can just capture, and it would not be able to be recaptured, of course. So the game continues with a knight launching forward, targeting the bishop and the knight. So what does Morphy do? He captures. We have a queen capture, and the queen is developed here off the back rank, connecting the rooks, as I mentioned, which is an important strategy, something you should aim for in your own chess games. Once you connect these rooks, they have more mobility. They're kind of backing each other up. They have more room to move, and they can slide in behind, as I mentioned, open files, half open files, or behind pawns you plan to press forward. So rook up to g7, perhaps getting ready to double the rooks. Another good strategy with your rooks, to double them up so they create a battery and they can work together. Morphy does this with queen and rook here on the half open d file, maybe targeting this pawn in the future, this backwards pawn. And so the game continues with rook protecting the pawn, and inaccuracy. Apparently knight to h5 would have been better. And then that knight can jump forward into white's position. So the queen grabs this open diagonal and targets the unprotected pawn. So something that can help improve your chess is every move, if you have time, or if there's not an obvious move, look for checks, captures, and threats. So, here, when the queen was back here, there wasn't really any good checks available. So, no checks. So any threats, any captures. So checks first, then captures. No unprotected pieces that could just be picked off. So then you look for threats. So the queen moves here, threatening to capture this pawn and forcing the opponent to either deal with that, deal with it in some way, either ignore it and maybe counterattack something else. Let's see what Paulson does. So he blocks the scope of the queen. So Morphy, he presses forward here, attacking, so creating a threat, attacking a pawn and the queen at the same time. So we have a capture, and this opens the G file. So we have a half open G file where the rooks can maybe double up here and try and cause trouble for Morphy. Queen captures, and instead of trading queens, there's a threat here of a checkmate by capturing here. So what does Morphy do? He doesn't trade queens. He just protects, stopping the threat. Then Paulson decides to capture here. So we have a recapture. Rooks double up, creating another threat. But the rook jumps up here to protect. And now this rook slides over, protecting this pawn, which was unprotected, of course, and the rook is putting pressure on that. So Morphy presses forward, attacking the knight, kind of stopping this backward pawn. The pawn can still press forward, but it would be captured, and the king would be kind of lured out onto this file where the rook and bishop could create some threats. So the knight blocks this half-open file, moves forward, attacking the rook here. So what does Morphy do? He just adds more pressure on this half-open file, even though it's blocked temporarily by the knight. So maybe the bishop will jump forward at some point and threaten to capture. So here we have a pawn counterattacking. Capture, knight captures, and the rook grabbing this half-open file. So now the king steps over to the side to prevent the possible fork here in the future of the rook moving up to the 7th rank. Another good strategy. If you can place one or even both rooks on the 7th rank, that can cause a lot of damage against your opponent. So Morphy just gains space on the queen side. The knight repositions onto this outpost here. A good spot kind of in the center of the board, giving this knight, some possible options in the future. So Morphy wants to knock that knight out of there. So what is the threat? Well, capture, pawn captures, and then the rook could capture here, gaining a pawn. So what does Paulson do? He drops back with the knight, although this is an inaccuracy. Apparently, knight to f4 is recommended. So, if we go back, if the knight would have gone here, what is the point behind that? Well, it piles up on this. Maybe the knight could threaten to jump here and then land on this outpost. That's another possibility. But in the game, we have a knight retreat. Bishop drops back here, allowing maybe the rooks to double up and go after this right here. So now we have a pawn pressing forward, attacking. So Morphy goes after the base of the pawn chain. A good strategy. If you can attack a chain of pawns, usually the weakest one is the base of the chain, the pawn in the back here, because no other pawn is protecting it. Whereas this backward pawn protects the forward pawn. No other pawn is protecting this pawn on e6. So Morphy takes advantage of that, targets this weakness. But, it looks like king to h2 would have been an even better move, according to the computer. But white is still in the lead. So here we have the rook getting behind the pawn. So perhaps, one, it kind of blocks the path of this rook on the king here. Maybe Paulson plans to push this pawn forward. But the knight is also protecting this backward pawn. So what does Morphy do? He adds pressure to that. Now, two pieces are attacking, only one defending. So with this threat, it forces his opponent to deal with that. So he comes up here to protect, and now more pressure is added. So the king comes up to help in the defense here. And now king to h2. So apparently this is the best move. Why? Well, there's a possibility now of pushing this pawn forward. So push forward. If this pawn captures, king could recapture, and Morphy will be left with this passed pawn, which can be dangerous as we go deeper into the endgame. All right, so the king steps over to the side here, and the pawn jumps forward. But now this is a mistake, apparently. It looks like rook to e1 is what the computer wants here, saying that's better. But, once again, white is still in the lead. So capture, king captures. Morphy has this dangerous passed pawn. So let's see how the game continues. The pawn marches forward up the board, and the knight repositions here, maybe to swing over and blockade this pawn. So the game continues with that pawn just marching forward, the knight attacking the bishop and the pawn. So rook and knight are piling up on the pawn. We have a capture here. So recapture. And the bishop recaptures here. So interesting play by Morphy. He goes after his opponent's passed pawn with a check on the king. So the king moves over. Apparently this is a mistake. King to f8 would have been better. So bishop drops back, helping protect. The knight captures, and we have an exchange. So we're down to a 3 pawns versus 3 and rook versus rook endgame. And let's take a look at this. Well, the action is over here, mostly on the queen side. Morphy has 3 pawns that are all side by side, whereas his opponent has this isolated pawn here, which could be weak in the endgame. So how does the game continue? We have a fork of king and pawn, so Morphy grabs an even bigger advantage here. The king moves up to centralize and help protect this pawn. Morphy grabs material here. The king is marching towards the center. So this is important in your own games. Make sure you use your king in the end game because there are not many pieces on the board here. That king can make a big difference here, especially if Morphy's king is not doing anything over here. So Morphy decides to go after another pawn here. And we have a check, a mistake. Apparently b5 is recommended. So if this pawn pushed forward, Morphy would either have to capture or he could just probably press his passed pawn forward. So the king moving to the center, the best move here by Morphy, trying to activate his king, and the king just keeps heading over to the queen side to assist these pawns. So this b5 move is finally found here. Still an excellent move, but king to d4 is even better. Trying to get over here and attack these pawns. So now we have capture. The rook is targeting the backward pawn here in these doubled pawns. So Morphy protects, but this pawn just presses forward trying to break them up. And Morphy playing the best move. Now he has 3 passed pawns, even though these are doubled, and his opponent only has 1 passed pawn. So Morphy is pretty much winning here. So let's see how he plays this out. And this can be instructive, especially for beginners. You have to learn, once you get an advantage, how do you press on with the win? So let's see how Morphy does it here. His opponent retreats back. Now this is a good strategy to get your rooks as far away from your opponent's king as possible. That way the king can't harass them. So Morphy immediately pressing these passed pawns up the board. So now we have check. The king moves over to the center and blockades his opponent's pawn. Check again. And Morphy just continues moving over. But he doesn't want to go too far. He has to keep an eye on this passed pawn of his opponent's. So check. And Morphy is looking for somewhere to escape from these checks. So here we go. Another check. The king jumps up to the center here. And now the king steps over, trying to get down here, well, maybe to help stop these pawns. But we have a check, and the pawn is running here. Now, this is pretty dangerous here. We have to watch out because there's a threat here of a mate. So Morphy gives up his rook here with check. Crazy move. And the game continues with the pawn pressing up the board here, threatening to promote. So the rook tries to stop it, but the other pawn is running now. The king moving over here, and the mate threat has been renewed. The rook could try and jump over here, but Morphy plays the winning move here. And now there's a mate, in 9 moves. So this is something very important in rook endgames. Once you get 2 pawns side by side on the 7th rank, there's no way for a rook to really stop one of those from promoting. So, if the one goes forward, he can capture, but then the other captures and promotes. So, interesting game by Paul Morphy there. I'll probably do some more Paul Morphy games, and I recommend you go over some Morphy games yourself and try to play through the games and calculate in your head, or try and figure out what move Morphy will make before you look at the move. Maybe cover the moves, or if you use a computer, try and cover the moves and click on the moves without knowing what they are ahead of time, and try and guess and see if you can figure out what Morphy is trying to do. All right, well, I hope this video was instructive for you. Feel free to leave any comments. Like and subscribe to support the channel if you haven't already. Thank you for watching, and have a super chess day.